I'm Professor David Dinges from the University of Pennsylvania School of Medicine, and I'm going to speak with you today about sleep and human performance. Our biological need for sleep emanates from structures in our brains that one of which is called a biological clock. Our biological clock in our brain not only controls our tendency to want to sleep and our tendency to want to be awake in the daytime, but it also very much controls or modulates our performance. In fact, this connection between our biological clock and where we are located on Earth is fundamental. That is to say that the biological clock in the human brain, shown here as these red dots, these are receptors for a hormone called melatonin, which is secreted by a gland in the brain called the pineal gland. But this is a light-sensitive hormone, so it's suppressed by light in the daytime and is secreted at night in the dark. And this is the biological clock, these red areas on a human brain. And the important thing to know about that clock is it's a real biological clock. It actually changes our physiology through a 24-hour cycle. And it has a near exact 24-hour cycle. It's 24 hours and a few minutes. And of course, that is the period of Earth's rotation on its axis. So as life developed on Earth, we find these biological clocks anticipate Earth's rotation through the light-dark cycle. And some animals that have clocks phased one way are diurnal, that is, they're awake in the day and asleep at night, and that would be humans among many animal species. And some are nocturnal, the ones that have a broad, flat face and a big eye, so they amplify light at night and hear well. They're awake at night and sleep in the day. And then many others are awake and asleep on the light-dark boundary. And of course, the light period is changing based on where you are on the planet, how far away from the equator. It's 12 hours equal at the equator. And that's because Earth is tilted about 23 degrees on its axis as it rotates annually around our sun. So in the winter, the photoperiod, or the amount of light, is fairly short in the northern hemisphere, and it's long in the southern hemisphere, and then that's reversed in what we call summer and they call a winter in the southern hemisphere. The point is that the regulatory systems for sleep are very old biologically and are related to the actual timing of light-dark and energy availability on the planet. All animals need sleep, all complex animals, and that includes the common fruit fly, otherwise known as Drosophila melanogaster, birds, these are pteropods, the current modern-day descendants of the dinosaurs, all mammals, including placental mammals like this leopard or this nocturnal South American tarsier, and of course chimps and humans, but also marsupials, the kangaroos, and the ancient order of mammals, the monotremes, like this platypus. Even mammals that live in aquatic environments, like the whale and the sea lion and the porpoise, and this is a manatee here, or sea cow, need sleep and engage in sleep. The remarkable thing about some of these cetaceans, like the porpoise and the orca, is that they sleep one half of their brain at a time. So one hemisphere of the brain, the right hemisphere, for example, might sleep while the left hemisphere keeps swimming and breathing, and then it switches. Unfortunately, that's not an adaptation that human land mammals have or that humans have, although I've heard people say they'd like to have it. We have no idea what consciousness is like for the animals that do it, but it is remarkable that sleep persists even in animals that cannot afford to have both hemispheres asleep at the same time. And of course, humans sleep, and they sleep a lot when they're born. They sleep somewhat less as they age and go through their lifespan. Young children and adolescents and young people need more sleep than they typically get in modern industrialized societies, in part because school start times are very early and children are often up very late with television and games and studying. And one of the problems we now face is the sort of epidemic of sleep deprivation among children, adolescents, and young adults. We know a great deal about how the sleep system affects our ability to perform, and by perform I mean our ability to think, our reaction times, our ability to make decisions, to remember the material we study, to pay close attention. We know that by bringing healthy young people into the laboratory, these are all adults, who volunteer to live in a laboratory where we control the light-dark cycle and when they sleep and when they're awake. Now they're instrumented with brainwave recording equipment and equipment for eye movement recording and muscle activity and heart recording, cardiovascular equipment, and they may have a blood line for recording blood or saliva, an activity monitor, core body temperature monitor, all the physiological factors or systems that are regulated by the biological clock and our need for sleep. And then they live on different sleep schedules in this environment, monitored 24 hours a day by both people, staff, but also by infrared cameras and monitoring systems. In the upper right of this slide, you see the computer test batteries that are used, that they work on every couple of hours to evaluate how their brain function and their behavioral performance. And then in the laboratory, you'll also see other equipment for recording the physiology. The equipment that they wear is roughly a $10,000 to $15,000 unit that records all of this as they move around. This is the best way to identify and establish unequivocally that humans are being controlled by their need for sleep and their biological clock. Now, everyone needs sleep, but there are differences among people in the duration of their sleep need. The real challenging question, in addition to asking what is sleep for, is the question of how much sleep do people need. Studies indicate that adolescents, and by that I mean people in the age range from 13 to 21 years of age, as defined by the National Institutes of Health, generally need more sleep per day, something like 8.5 to 10 hours, than do most adults, who are typically in the range of 7 to 8 hours. Now, this is a problem because the way we currently operate our school systems, the older you are, that is, the closer you are to being in high school, the earlier school start time is. And many adolescents will stay up late at night. The bottom line is they'll end up getting 6 or 5 or 7 hours of sleep when they really need 8.5 to 10. And as you'll see in a little bit, that produces a cumulative sleep debt. Adolescents are vulnerable to sleep loss in part because in modern day society, there's plenty of things one can do at night. In older agrarian economies and societies, people could go to sleep when it got dark, when the animals tended to go to sleep. And that was because there wasn't television and radio and computers and video games and telephones and 100 ways to interact socially or to work or play. But now we have societies where millions of people are awake at night doing night shift work or traveling across time zones, and among the young adult and adolescent community that also means work and play. The net result is that nighttime has become a much more active period. Midnight, after all, used to mean in the middle of the night, and now it means the time many people go to bed, or they even go to bed after midnight. Excessive daytime sleepiness results when adolescents or young adults or anyone doesn't get adequate sleep at night. It often reflects what we call a sleep debt, which is indicative of inadequate sleep duration at night. Now, it can also mean that you've got ample sleep duration, but you have a sleep disorder that's disturbing the quality or depth of your sleep. But for most healthy people, it's simply a curtailment of their total sleep time, and they're not getting adequate amounts of sleep. We know that this happens because we see, for example, young adults or adolescents or older adults who shorten their sleep during the work week and then on the weekends grossly oversleep by 10 or 12 hours because there's this enormous physiologic pressure in the brain to catch up on the sleep that's been deprived. Now, as I mentioned earlier, you can actually also have poor sleep, as can adolescents, due to a sleep disorder. And this slide shows us 3 common disorders that can occur in adolescence. The first is, this bottom point, the delayed sleep phase syndrome. This is a problem that some adolescents and young adults get into, in which by staying awake late at night till 3 or 4 in the morning, they suddenly discover they can't fall asleep before that, even when they go to bed early, like at midnight. The net result is they're not only unable to fall asleep until 3 or 4 in the morning, they can't get up and out of bed to go to school or anything else until 9 or 10 or 11 in the morning. They have a delayed sleep phase. The source of this problem appears to be in their circadian or biological clock, this 24-hour clock in the brain. The repair of this problem is complicated and requires medical attention to try to realign the biological clock with clock time in the social world. But it can be treated in sleep disorder centers. Another common problem is a difficulty falling asleep or staying asleep, widely known as insomnia. Many adolescents, young adults, experience stress or are light sleepers or just have trouble being able to sustain sleep, even though they may have a sleep debt and are very, very tired. And again, this can be treated by consulting a physician, particularly an expert in sleep and sleep disorders. And then finally, some adolescents and children we now know can have something called obstructive sleep apnea, which we used to think primarily affected only older adults. And obstructive sleep apnea refers to the cessation of normal breathing during sleep. The airway collapses once the brain goes to sleep. It doesn't collapse when you're awake or when you lie down. It only happens when you fall asleep. The net result is sleep is fragmented, you don't sleep deeply, and the next day you can be pathologically sleepy. So all three of these categories of problems can occur in young adults and adolescents, as well as some other even more unusual but rarer sleep disorders. But they're all treatable, but they can lead to sleep debt and problems functioning. Now, we have ways of measuring biologically the pressure for sleep in the brain, and one of those is to actually measure the brain waves, or electroencephalography, or EEG, shown here on the left of this graph. As you can see at the top, we've got a graph that shows the waking or alert EEG. It's very fast frequency and very low amplitude. Once the person starts to get drowsy or closes their eyes, you can see there is a shift in the amount of activity in the EEG. It's slower activity. This is called alpha, and then theta at stage 1, and it's higher voltage. And ultimately, it ends up with this very high voltage, slow wave delta sleep shown here by the fifth red area on the left side of this graph. This slow wave, stage 3-4 sleep, is very deep, non-rapid eye movement sleep, and the brain gives it a priority. When you're sleep deprived, the brain goes into this stage of sleep very rapidly. That is to say, it transitions through these other stages rapidly to get to this deep, intense sleep. We know that this is a marker, this intense, deep, slow wave sleep is a marker for a structure in the middle of the brain called the thalamus, which is the sensory relay station for all your sensory systems as they project up to your upper brain, to disconnect from the upper brain. So this is the sensory input part of your brain shutting off and no longer dialoguing or interconnecting with the cortex in a functional sense. So the upper part of your brain doesn't know that there's stimulation coming in because it's been disconnected. And that's part of the mechanism of ensuring that you not only go to sleep, but you stay asleep. You can imagine the problems, though, if you progress to this sleep stage and then try to wake up abruptly and function. It's very difficult. If you've ever been awakened from a very deep sleep, it's likely that it occurred in this stage, and that's called sleep inertia. At the very bottom of the graph is the rapid eye movement sleep, the activated EEG that occurs when we dream, not exclusively in REM, but our most vivid dreams are in REM. This occurs after slow wave sleep, periodically throughout the night. But we can't act out our dreams because during rapid eye movement sleep, even though the cortex looks like it's awake when you look at the brain waves, ironically, we are paralyzed. There are spinal motor neurons, that is, in our spine, the neurons or nerve cells that control our skeletal muscles are disconnected. So we are actually paralyzed functionally during the periods of REM sleep. So we're having vivid dreams and our eyes are jerking, we're breathing rapidly, our brain's activated, but we're completely disconnected from the outside world and can't move or act out these dreams. There are disorders where people can act out the dreams that occur late in life in neurodegenerative diseases, but not found in younger adults. On the right side of that graph is the latency to fall asleep. Just to make a point that once, this is on the x-abscissa here is time awake. The longer people are awake, the more rapidly they fall asleep. These points are latency, or how quickly you move from awake EEG to a sleep EEG to a very deep sleep EEG. And what you can see is brainwave activity accelerates towards very deep sleep, so that once you've been awake all night, you could fall asleep in a second. And you can progress into very deep sleep very rapidly. It is this characteristic of the sleep homeostat or sleep propensity system in the brain that it accelerates towards sleep uncontrollably and rapidly when there's high sleep pressure that makes sleepiness so dangerous for driving. Because if you give in even a little bit to it, you may find you can't pull out of the sleep that your brain goes into and you crash. And I'll talk more about that in a minute. Now, when we use sophisticated scientific techniques like brain imaging, and this is something called positron emission tomography or PET imaging, where we look at the metabolic activity, glucose-based or basic sugar-based metabolism in the brain of sleep-deprived people, what we see is these blue-green areas are areas of the brain that are less active when you're sleep-deprived. Now, this is important because these areas are the primary areas your brain uses for thinking, reacting, paying attention, remembering, and processing information. So there's reduced activity in this thalamus, this sensory relay center in the brain, and then which projects to the cortex up above the upper brain, but also there's reduced activity in the prefrontal cortex, and there's reduced activity in the parietal lobes. Now, the prefrontal cortex, if you put your hand on your forehead, that's the prefrontal cortex right behind your forehead. That whole part of your brain is your executive attention system. It keeps track of everything you're doing. It remembers that you have to go to football practice or play in the band at 5 o'clock. It's the one that remembers what your assignment was in class. It's the one that makes sure you can focus on that assignment when time comes. And that shows reduced activity during sleep loss. And the other area that's critical for compensating for impairment of the prefrontal cortex and helps it out is the parietal lobe back here, and that also shows reduced activity. So the worrisome aspect of this slide is the very areas of your brain you most want to use for performance every day, whether it's out on the basketball court or whether it's in the physics class or the English class or the creative writing class, those are the parts of the brain that are most affected by inadequate amounts of sleep. The way in which most people become impaired by sleepiness is through the way they live their lives, as I mentioned earlier. And in adolescents and young adults, and in millions of other people in the world, that can mean not sleeping enough at night. And there were recently completed and published major scientific studies in which healthy adults were kept in a laboratory for 20 days. And this graph shows 14 of those days, plus an original baseline day. And for these 14 days, a group of these people were given 8 hours time in bed a night for sleep. So this is the control condition. Another group were randomized or randomly assigned to a condition in which they got 6 hours time in bed at night for sleep, every night for 14 consecutive nights. And a final group was randomized to 4 hours time in bed for sleep at night. Then each point is the average of all the test bouts, the performance test bouts on an attention task that they completed that day from 7:30 in the morning until midnight, each one of the groups. So thousands and thousands of points went into this experiment. I want to remind you that people stayed in the laboratory in this study so we could control all the factors that might influence or introduce error into these assessments. We then looked at how well they were able to sustain attention on simple tasks, remember things, process information. And this slide shows on the y-ordinate the lapses of attention during a vigilance or sustained attention task. These are basically the number of times the signal was on, they were holding the response button, but they failed to respond in a timely manner. And what you see is that the 8-hour condition stays very near zero in the green area. This is all normal functioning. Only after around 12 days, around the 13 to 14 day, does the average drift slightly above normal, and that's really due to 2 subjects who needed more time in bed than the 8 hours allowed. But remarkably, the 6-hour and 4-hour conditions showed an immediate and progressive impairment developing day after day. And around the 5th or 6th day, they separated, so that the 4-hour was even worse than the 6-hour. And most importantly, both of these conditions, the people developed performance impairments equivalent to people who had been awake in another experiment without any sleep for 24 to 40 hours, that's a full night without sleep, and the next day. And they actually progressed up to a level shown here by the upper arrow to a group that had been awake 40 to 64 hours. That's nearly 3 days without any sleep. So these progressive impairments indicate that the system keeps building up what is called debt for sleep, and that it manifests this in continuing inability, ever worsening inability to sustain attention, to remember things, to process information quickly, make good decisions, drive, etc. So it's very sensitive homeostatic system, and the only way to stop this is to get sleep. Once sleep is allowed, and that's being studied now in laboratories around the world, you then see the recovery function of how much sleep nets you how much recovery. But as long as sleep is reduced, as long as you're only getting 4 hours or 6 hours, you get impairment. This tells us that most people need much more than 6 hours sleep, and in fact, they need something closer to 8 hours or 7.5 of physiologic sleep a night. Now, one of the remarkable things not shown on this slide is that when people went through this experiment and we asked them every 2 hours, how are you feeling, how are you doing, have you adapted, are you alert, are you fatigued, etc., are you sleepy, they kept telling us as the experiment went on that they were fine. In other words, the first day or two they said they were a little more tired, but as the experiment went on, they showed no increase in their fatigue. They just kept saying they've adapted. Yes, they were tired, but they've adapted. They're not feeling any worse. So at the time when they were maximally impaired, around the 13th day, they said that they were okay, they were normal and adapted. So this makes chronic sleep restriction, which is widespread in the world and occurs certainly in young adults and adolescents, something that's of grave concern because people cannot introspect their impairment. They're not aware of how dangerous they are if they drive in this condition, or the extent to which they're going to have trouble paying attention in class, remembering material they've read, or engaging in other activities. Even physical activities like sports where reaction time matters. These, after all, are measures of slowed reaction time. Finally, I just want to mention that this does have grave implications for driving. And we highlight driving relative to sleepiness because there is a significant effort in the medical and governmental communities to try and prevent drowsy driving crashes, which claim thousands of lives a year and tens of thousands of people are injured by them. The studies have shown, and this is data from one of them that we did at the University of Pennsylvania, that drowsy driving crashes are particularly likely to occur at night between the hours of 11:30 or 11 p.m., shown over here on the right, and all the way through midnight to 4 a.m., 6 a.m., 8 a.m., and they peak in the morning. Now, of particular concern in this study was evidence that they were 3 times more likely to occur in males, and most importantly, the group that by far and away had the most of these were young adults and adolescents between the ages of 16 and 24. So males, particularly out at night driving with inadequate sleep, are at very high risk for fall-asleep crashes. These crashes are particularly lethal and have high bodily injury rates because typically the driver fails to brake or gain control of steering and avoid the collision. They fall asleep and hit the object, an abutment, or run off the road and hit a tree at full force, that is, the car moving at full speed. So this is an area in which prevention has been a major focus, trying to reduce these crashes. I want to just say that these are not alcohol related. They've been proven not to be. All of these crashes have there was no alcohol involved or any other drugs. These are young people falling asleep. So even if you don't care about falling asleep in class and you don't care about falling asleep on the job, if it's not a safety sensitive job, you should care about driving, operating a motor vehicle, or any safety sensitive equipment when you're sleepy, and that alone is a good enough reason to get your sleep. But frankly, everything you learn, you will remember better if you get your sleep. Everything you do, you will do better if you get your sleep. And it's not enough to cheat your sleep during the work week and then try to recover on the weekend. But rather, it's much better to try to live a more disciplined schedule that ensures you get as much sleep as you can during the week and avoid trying to do things like driving at night, particularly long drives at night, where you're most vulnerable to fall asleep crashes. Thank you.